right, so it's a little bit later in the day for me because life is life and I got distracted. But continuing on, now we are on slide 29. Like I said, I know it's a long lecture, but bear with me because it's useful information. So other areas of rehabilitation can include forensic rehabilitation, which at one point in my career I thought, I'm going to go back and get a certificate in forensic rehabilitation. There are like these additional certificate programs that you can participate in, or you could just work forever in rehabilitation counseling and become an expert witness based on the knowledge that you have gained throughout your career. So forensic rehabilitation takes the form of as an expert witness by and large, and this can be for Social Security determinations, SSDI determinations. It can be for cases related to employment discrimination, personal injury cases, basically some consulting essentially for life care planning purposes and family court. And for medical malpractice and wrongful death suits. So there are a lot of different areas that somebody that has the knowledge and has the expertise can provide their expertise in, essentially. And so, you're hired by an attorney or a client of an attorney to provide expert witness and expert testimony services. You make a decent amount of money doing this, which is a fun little fact, but it takes a certain type of personality and I think a certain knowledge base to be able to effectively and efficiently testify in a court setting while being completely objective. So, and like I said, there are some educational training programs, some certificate programs that do exist out there, if that would be something you're interested in down the road. Other areas of the private sector can include life care planning. So if an individual has some type of injury or a chronic illness and they're kind of looking at the long-term plan that they might have, it kind of falls under the medical case management scope of practice, but it certainly can be an area of private for-profit practice for rehab counselors. Disability management, this is working in employment settings to offset the costs associated with employees being out of work due to injury or illness. There's substance use counseling. Typically this might be through an EAP program, again working for an employer or an insurance company through their employee assistance program, which would be private for profit, and consulting services that are related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are consultants that provide services much like what they do at Job Accommodation Network, where they're focused just on the employment provisions of the ADA. There are people out there working independently as consultants that provide information on all the titles of the ADA and provide consulting services to businesses and employers and government agencies and the like. So this again is going to require that kind of high level knowledge and expertise in everything related to the ADA. Excuse me. All right, so moving on to the different types of rehabilitation facilities, support services, independent living, kind of the last section of this relatively long lecture, if you will. So when we think of rehabilitation facilities, there are three main rehabilitation facilities in the United States of America. One is the Arkansas Career Training Institute, which has about 400 students annually. The second one is the Wilson Workforce and Rehab Center. It used to be known as the Woodrow Wilson Rehabilitation Facility. Well, actually, I take that back. There's just the two. There used to be a third one. So these facilities, so these are the main two, I would say, but they provide basically in-house services for individuals that need an array of services. So people will actually go and become students at these rehabilitation facilities. And it's a one-stop shop essentially. So they're living there oftentimes. Sometimes their families are living there with them. And they're providing, the facility itself is providing medical and vocational services. There's physicians on staff, physiatrists, OT, physical therapy, speech language pathologists, audiologists, therapists, assistive technology professionals, rehab engineers. I mean, you name it. Anybody that can kind of fall under the umbrella of an allied health professional could potentially be working at one of these rehabilitation facilities. And like I said, an individual with a disability would essentially become a student of a facility or a resident, and they're going to be there for an extended period of time, going through the evaluations that they might need, being provided with some additional training, and doing evaluations and going through the whole VR process in general, but also being provided with other support services. So the transitional programs are really to move a person into the labor market, into their communities, placing them within competitive employment settings. And then there's also kind of the long-term workshop options where an individual is receiving services for as long as necessary. And in terms of being an advocate for people with disabilities, advocates don't tend to like the model where somebody's in a workshop for the long term because it could be considered a barrier to employment. So some strengths of workshops in general are that there's extensive information being provided on client strengths and abilities. There's the ability of rehab counselors, other allied health providers to observe those individuals over a period of time, and individuals getting very individualized services and integrated service provision, meaning that there can be a number of hands in the mixing bowl, if you will, working to provide services to a client. The limitations, of course, the client is living in a protected environment. They're expected to be passive, kind of a patient in that patient care facility setting, but at the same time that doesn't really work well with our client-centered model of treatment that we use now. And sometimes clients can get kind of stuck in that sick role, the meaning that they get too accustomed to having all the service providers around there and helping them all the time. So kind of switching gears here and looking at school to work transition and how that's a different type of service delivery system. So this is where we're looking at the provision of transition services within schools, being a high school setting, and helping students with disabilities, young adults, seamlessly transition from high school into either the workforce or into a secondary education setting. So transition planning and transition services have been a mainstay of the goals of vocational rehabilitation counselors for decades, but from the 90s until 2014 or so, there was a little bit of straying from the goal of getting voc rehab counselors in schools at the appropriate time and getting them working with clients, actively working with them, so that those students are adequately prepared when they're done with high school. So the transition services are supposed to start as early as age 14. And then with the WIOA, it really re-emphasized how important it is to get voc rehab counselors in the school systems and working on those transition teams sooner than later, so that the student can have all the paperwork done, have all the assessments done, so that they can become clients of VR right after high school and be ready to go. Okay, so I kind of already went through slide 37 as well. So in terms of transition services, there are a number of different things that WIOA kind of, again, emphasized that we need to be looking at as rehab counselors working in school settings. One is accountability. So really this was kind of the understanding that academic achievement, graduating, doesn't guarantee employment. So students that were working with, had a 504 plan or an IEP in place, just because those things were there and they were receiving those services throughout high school, didn't mean that once they graduated, they would just be ready to go into a job. even those that did graduate or do graduate, a lot of times find themselves in low-paying, low-status jobs, or they might not be prepared for the work that they might be doing. So all of this said to the higher ups and the vocational rehabilitation world that that additional work needed to be done to adequately prepare students so that they were getting in jobs that were meaningful, and able to continue on with those jobs and for the long term and potentially turn them into careers. The process itself, so the goals for the student, need to be the same as a goal for any other client that we're working with. They need to be realistic, attainable. The goals require oftentimes this multidisciplinary team to be working together, and to really be looking at the IEP, and seeing how the individualized education program plays into the overall goal of eventually developing an IPE, an individualized plan for employment. So when we're looking at an IEP team, the individualized education program, the process is really driven by a special education teacher, and the VR serves as an ally essentially, or a liaison. A VR counselor can provide an assessment of vocational potential. They can start vocational planning, potentially doing some of those general career interest inventories, those types of assessments, putting into place, what other types of services might be needed for the student. Will they need to have an assistive technology assessment whenever they're ready to go? Will they need more of that kind of hands-on job placement, job development service? And certainly follow-up is important to always write into some of these plans. So the outcome of a transition, transition services in general, or transition team, employment is certainly emphasized, but it can also be, volunteer work, getting in the community, doing some trial work periods, continuing with education, or even just living independently. And so, again, kind of going back to the array of services, that VR counselor might be, linking the student and their support system up with like the Centers for Independent Living. So moving into the independent living movement, and we're on slide 40 here now, and just kind of moving through slide 40 through 44. But the independent living movement truly was a movement, much like all the other civil rights movements, and much like the other civil rights movements. It started in the 60s. It really emerged as a result of society's view of how people with disabilities should be living. And back then, we were seeing that people with disabilities were oftentimes institutionalized, meaning that it was kind of society's view of people with disabilities was they couldn't live alone. They couldn't make their own choices. They needed to be constantly watched, constantly monitored. Their disabilities need to be treated and fixed. Remember, working from a medical model at this period in time. The parents, the physicians, the individual support system, they were the experts and not the individual with the disability. There was not ever a consideration of community integration. And so if we remember back to the discussion at the internship seminar by Jan Derry, that, that's kind of a good example of what it was like for a person who was diagnosed at a young age and then filtered through the system, and she herself being institutionalized for not only a large period of time, but in terms of her development, her lifespan development at a critical point in her life. So community integration was never really an option back then. It was that if somebody received a diagnosis or had a physical disability and was put into an institution, that's where they remained. And there wasn't any thought that they would be leaving that type of facility unless they could overcome a disability, essentially. So in the 1960s, this independent living movement started. There's a lot of different documentaries that are fantastic out there. PBS put one out a number of years ago on the independent living movement that is just phenomenal. If you have time to watch any of those, I encourage you to do so. There's also a book called No Pity that is really a great point of reference as well from the perspective of a person with a disability and how society's perceptions of people with disabilities has changed over time. But the independent living movement in general, it fought for independence in multiple areas. One was employment and equal opportunity. And this is kind of the advent of the Rehabilitation Act as well. Another area was access to businesses and services, so accessibility in general. Transportation was a huge one. There were sit-ins, there were strikes in the same way that there were, in the South in the civil rights movement. And the hopes of all of it was to encourage policymakers to consider people with disabilities as people, as humans that had needs and desires and wants and wanted to access and should be able to access everything else that any able-bodied person would be able to. The independent living movement, and there were certainly other social movements that came along with it. Consumerism kind of being where persons with disabilities are able to control services being provided. So viewing the client or the patient, as it were known, as a consumer. Centers for Independent Living came about as a result of the independent living movement, obviously. Demedicalization, so looking at those who have stable conditions and allowing them to be in charge of their medical care, kind of changing that mindset from the medical model and believing that people with disabilities could or should be cured or fixed, and knowing that some individuals weren't working toward a recovery that a medical provider would think would be kind of the goal to work towards. And again, deinstitutionalization, so an understanding that people with disabilities can live outside of medical facilities. And whenever these institutions shut down, I would say at the time it was obviously a good thing. The institutions were there were lots of different problems that came about with those institutions, from mistreatment of individuals with disabilities to full-out abuse, and kind of and all the bad things that you might hear about when it comes to institutions. But some of the issues that came up were where do these individuals go? And so we saw an increase in homelessness for people with psychiatric disabilities after deinstitutionalization, after these institutions closed. But we also saw an increase in kind of these long-term residential centers, transitional centers, group homes, and things of that nature that are still to this day not without their own faults. There's always room for improvement there. So, and to kind of wrap it up here on slide 43 and 44, and thinking about the independent living movement resulting in Centers for Independent Living. The first Center for Independent Living, or CIL, CIL, started in Berkeley in California in the 1970s. They're community-based organizations that are staffed by people with disabilities. And more importantly, directors of the Centers for Independent Living are individuals with severe disabilities. And so there's a number of core services that the CILs provide. One, of course, informational referral services. This could be referrals to vocational rehabilitation, to Social Security, to assistive technology projects, so just community resources in general. Independent living skills training, so assisting those with disabilities in learning how to manage a house, how to balance a checkbook, how to grocery shop, how to cook a meal, how to clean a house, things of that nature. Individual and systems advocacy. So these groups are doing a lot of advocacy work in their communities, ensuring that that community members with disabilities are afforded the same opportunities and access to different services. And peer counseling is a huge one too. So the Centers for Independent Living are staffed by people with disabilities, so they're able to provide that peer support and that peer counseling to other individuals with disabilities. And that certainly, well, I don't know what I was going to say with that one, but it's been a long day. So where to find them. So I provided some links on this final slide of where you can find your Center for Independent Living. Centers for Independent Living are all around the country. Every community has them. They're an important resource to know about. They're one that you may want to interview for your community resource project. So I encourage you to take a look at the websites and find out where your local Center for Independent Living is, and just so at the very least you have that contact. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up because this has been a lot of talking on my part, and I hope you guys found it marginally interesting, but I'm going to provide some notes that will summarize some of this information for you too, so you have a little bit more concise printout to study for the final exam.